7. Notes. 1. An important question with respect to homosexuality is raised by 1 Corinthians 6, 9-11. Romans 1, 24-32 cites homosexuality as the culmination of apostasy and a burning out of man, whereas 1 Corinthians 6, 9-11 seems to open the door of salvation to abusers of themselves with mankind. In this passage, Paul lists 10 representative forms of unrighteousness which bar men from God's kingdom, unless God's grace intervenes in some cases. One of these, the effeminate, has reference to voluptuaries. The catalog of sins covers, quote, false religion and irreligion, sexual vices, sins against property, and sins of the tongue, end quote. St. Paul was telling the Corinthians of the kind of offense which separated men from God. He was not charging the Corinthians with commission of all these offenses. All were redeemed sinners, but some of you, St. Paul reminds them, were guilty of grosser sins prior to their conversion. According to Hodge on verse 11, quote, "And such were some of you." The natural explanation is that the apostle designedly avoided charging the gross immoralities just referred to upon all the Corinthian Christians in their previous condition, end quote. This verse thus does not tell us that former homosexuals were among the redeemed in the Corinthian church. It can be noted, however, that in Greek education, youths were commonly seduced into homosexual practices by their tutors and teachers, a charge much earlier made with justice against Socrates. The burning out of man described in Romans is not to be confused with the sins of some of these Corinthians as young boys in the hands of degenerate teachers. Perhaps 1 Corinthians 6, 9-11 covers persons seduced into this vicious type of practice and experience, and thus makes their redemption an open question, whereas Romans 1, 26-32 presents the homosexual as the burned out and reprobate mind in action, and as a culmination of apostasy and reprobation. 2. In July 1562, the Council of Trent considered the matter of children and communion, and issued a statement, one of 4 points on the sacrament, with 4 anathemas. This 4th point, and all 4 anathemas, read as follows, quote, 4. Children below the age of reason are not obliged to receive the sacrament of communion, because at that age they cannot lose grace. However, the opposite custom, which is ancient and preserved in some places, is not to be condemned, because it is doubtless to be believed that it was not done as necessary for salvation, but for some other reason. In conformity with this doctrine, 4 anathemas were read. Quote, 1. Against whoever says that all the faithful are obliged to receive the Eucharist under both kinds, either by divine command or as necessary for their salvation. 2. Against whoever says that the Catholic Church has no good reason or that it has erred in giving the laity and those not celebrating Mass communion under the form of bread alone. 3. Against whoever denies that Christ, fount and author of all grace, is received under the form of bread alone. 4. Against whoever says that the sacrament of the Eucharist is necessary for children below the age of reason. End quote. It is significant that Trent recognized that communion by children was a practice, quote, ancient and preserved in some places, and not to be condemned, end quote. Calvin, who at one point opposed the practice, left room for it in his last communion service, with an exhortation fencing the table, however, from, quote, all who are rebellious against fathers and mothers, end quote. 3. The rising civil demand for restitution to victims of crime has gained legal attention and minor enactment. The May-June 1972 issue of Trial, Volume 8, Number 3, the legal magazine published by the American Trial Lawyers Association, was extensively devoted to compensation. The basic idea, however, is compensation by the state to the victim, rather than restitution by the criminal to his victim. 4. Samuel Willard, Puritan divine in New England, is an example of the Puritan view of the law. He held that the norm of sanctification is the law of God, and opposed the antinomian view of the law. See Seymour Van Dyken, Samuel Willard, 1640 to 1707. Preacher of Orthodoxy in an Era of Change. Grand Rapids, Michigan, Eerdmans, 1972, page 131. The end.